The next interview is with Tim Mazzei.
Hello, everyone. This is Tuesday, May 21st, 2013. I am Wendy Bennett, a librarian at Bayport-Blue Library, and I am with Tim Mazzei today. Hello, Tim.
Good morning, Wendy.
Tim, could you please tell me your full name?
My full name is Timothy P. Mazzei.
And when and where were you born?
I was born actually at Southside Hospital, but born on Boylan Lane initially. We lived there until I was 2, and then we moved to Bayview Avenue in Blue Point. Lived at Bayview Avenue, 32 Bayview Avenue, until I was a senior in high school. And then we moved in the back lot, which was on Oak Lane, and I lived there until I moved out after law school. So I've lived in Blue Point my whole life.
Great. And what year were you born?
1954. I'm one of the old guys.
And how did your family come to live in Blue Point?
My grandparents came from Italy and initially settled off of Waverly Avenue in Patchogue, which was a very Italian community back in the early 1900s, and then moved to Montauk Highway in Blue Point. I'm not sure the year, but where the house right next to the Sage Cafe was the house where my father grew up in. Oh. And then during World War II, when my father was actually it was in prisoner of war camp, my grandfather bought the house across the street on the piece of property which now the restaurant Blue sits on. Oh. So my father grew up in the house on Montauk Highway, on the south side of Montauk Highway. My mother's family lived in Bayport and Blue Point their whole life as well. So both my parents have lived my father in Blue Point, my mother in either Bayport or Blue Point, because she moved a couple of times. Their whole lives, they've lived in Blue Point and Bayport. And when they got married, they actually lived for a short period of time in the house that my father grew up in on the south side of Montauk Highway. And then they purchased the house on Boylan Lane, which is the house that I was born in.
And what high school did you attend?
Bayport. In those days, it was called James Wilson Young High School, but now it's Bayport Blue Point High School, which is better.
Tell me a little bit about the jobs that you have had and how they pertain to Blue Point.
Well, growing up, I worked on the Davis Park Ferry Company since I was 15, and during college and law school, I worked for my father in the title business, and after law school, I got a job in the district attorney's office, stayed there for about 10 years, and have been in private practice since then. My office now is also in Blue Point.
So, being a lifelong resident of Blue Point, how have you seen major historical events like storms, wars, affect the community of Blue Point?
Well, I would think that storms, hurricanes, since you mentioned storms, I think hurricanes is the thing that I think about quite often, obviously more so now than ever because of Hurricane Sandy. But since we live on the South Shore and are affected by the tidal currents, if you will, the tides, obviously, wind, I can remember many hurricanes over the years. Thank God not devastating like Sandy, but certainly they have affected life in Blue Point, certainly on Long Island. Mm-hmm. So that's something we, obviously living on the South Shore, that's something you always have to be careful of and always watchful for. So that's probably something that jumps out in my mind. I always had some kind of a boat, from a little rowboat to a motorboat over the years. And whenever we get storms, you're always concerned about your boat. And since we're a boating community, that certainly comes to mind as well.
What is your earliest memory of living in Blue Point?
Well, I actually, believe it or not, I actually remember living on Boylan Lane and moving to Bayview Avenue. My father built the house on Bayview Avenue. So I actually remember moving there as a young boy. And, I've always been involved with the bay, the ocean, water. My father had a boat when I was a kid. So my life has revolved around boating to one extent or another. So that's something that I always think about even to this day.
Sure. It's such a big part of this
It
community,
is
too.
a very big part of
Yeah.
this community.
So thinking about Blue Point when you were younger compared to now, what would you say are some of the main changes that you see?
Well, certainly development, even though Blue Point was a developed community when I was a child, I've seen it increase over the years, certainly to the point where I think one of the developed as we thank God more. But Blue Point is still a great place to live. It's few communities on Long Island that people come back to. I mean, I never left, other than going to college and law school. I've lived in Blue Point my whole life. And it's still a great place to live. It's a great community. Great people live here. We have a wonderful sense of community in Blue Point. It's still the same in that sense. Blue Point means a lot to people who have grown up in Blue Point, and people who have come to Blue Point to settle, I think, realize what a wonderful community that we really have.
Now, growing up, what places stand out the most in your mind in terms of maybe stores or organizations? Certainly the beach, I'm sure.
Well, Corey Beach certainly is at the top of the list. Everybody growing up in Blue Point has gone to or continues to go to Corey Beach to this day. If you have a boat, then or take the ferry, certainly Davis Park is also at the top of the list, even though it's not in Blue Point. Certainly we think of Davis Park as part of our community to some extent. A lot of people from Blue Point go to Davis Park, so that's something I think about. Blue Point Elementary School is something I always think about, the teachers that I had at Blue Point Elementary School. I don't know if it's going to be relevant in any of the questions you're going to ask, but certainly one of the things that I always think about, to this day I think about quite often, is the impact and the influence that Herbert Hannon, who was my 6th grade teacher at Blue Point Elementary School, had on me and many, many other people. He was just a wonderful, wonderful man. He had such an influence on so many people growing up in Blue Point, and certainly had a great effect on my education and certainly my occupation.
And what sort of impact did he have on you? Can you speak a little more to that?
He was just such a great guy. He was a disciplinarian, but once you graduated from the 6th grade with Mr. Hannon, you had such a great outlook on the rest of your education. You had such a great outlook on life. He was such a wonderful influence on me, I've never forgotten him, never.
And was he a resident here?
Yes, he was. He actually lived on the corner of Danes and Blue Point Avenue. He had a big, played the organ for, I believe, one of the churches in Sayville, and he had a big organ in his house. And as kids, I was very close with Mr. Hannon, and myself and Greg Kavanaugh, and some of the other kids in the community. We would go over and just knock on his door, and he'd have us come in, and he'd play the organ, and he was just a great guy.
That doesn't happen anymore.
That stuff, I'm sure, does not happen anymore.
Now, in terms of local events like parades or gatherings, do you remember any sort of local events that stick out in your mind growing up in Blue Point?
The Memorial Day Parade, which is, although it's not the biggest parade on Long Island, it's certainly very important to Blue Point. I remember that very well as a young boy. My uncle Bill Rogers, who lived on Boylan Lane, was also a councilman in the town of Brookhaven, and I remember him speaking, as I now speak on Memorial Day at the firehouse. I remember him speaking as our councilman in front of the firehouse when I was a young boy. So that's certainly something I remember very well.
Do you remember when the local railroad station closed?
I remember when it was open. I don't remember specifically the year that it closed, but I remember us having a railroad station, albeit not a big one. But I do remember us having a stop, probably is the better way to put it. But I do remember that very well, sure.
Okay. Do you remember what it looked like, or did you ever go inside?
My recollection is it really wasn't a whole lot of anything other than a covered for people to stand in until the train came to pick you up. It wasn't, a station like Patchogue or Sayville has. But it was our little station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you remember any stories or legends about Blue Point that may have gone around?
I mean, there's so many good people that have lived and unfortunately died in Blue Point. I can think of a lot of people who, as growing up, were legends already. Charlie Stroh was certainly a legend. He was actually my mother's cousin. Dick Berg, growing up, was a great guy. Both of them involved in the fire department. Al Furchett Sr. was a rock of Blue Point, member of the fire department, owned the gas station in Blue Point Friendly Service for many, many years. Al, his son, continued that for a long period of time. There's a lot of great people that have gone through Blue Point. A little biased, but certainly my father, having lived in Blue Point his whole life, he was a prisoner of war in World War II, buried behind the library. So he, in my mind, was a hero of Blue Point.
And how did your parents feel about living in Blue Point?
They loved it.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody who lives in Blue Point that doesn't love living in Blue Point.
It's a nice community.
It's a wonderful community.
So I would imagine that you were active in many local organizations. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was mostly sports. I played football, basketball, and baseball at Bayport High School. So that was really, I was what you'd call a jock in those days. So sports were very important to me, and obviously I was involved all school year round in one sport or another. So that was probably the main thing that I was involved with.
So in thinking about how Blue Point used to be to now, what do you miss about the way it used to be, maybe growing up as you remember it?
The people that are no longer with us, that including obviously my parents, my grandparents. My grandparents lived in Blue Point all of my life until they died. I have aunts and uncles that still live in Blue Point, and they've lived there in Blue Point their whole lives. We're missing, unfortunately, a lot of people have passed. So I think probably the one thing that I miss is the people that are no longer with us in Blue Point, who were very important to Blue Point, very important to me, certainly.
All right, so is there anything that I didn't mention that you would like to add, wrapping up here?
I just want to repeat what I think I've said already, and that is that Blue Point is still a great place to live. It's still a great place to grow up in. My daughter, I'm very proud of the fact that I went to the same elementary school as my father. My daughters went through the same elementary school that I did. I hope her children go through Blue Point Elementary School. It's still a great place to grow up in. It's still a great place to live. And although there have been some changes over the years, certainly with more development than it was when I was a kid, I don't think that we're overdeveloped, certainly. And because of that, I think it's still just a wonderful, wonderful community.
This marks the end of the interview with Tim Mazzei.